The mountain air was always thinnest just before midnight, the kind of cold that seeped through layers of wool and settled deep into aching joints. Elion didn't mind the chill. It was a small price to pay for the clarity of the sky. High above the world, tucked away in his stone observatory, the ground and its many cruelties felt like a distant memory. Up here there were no uneven cobblestones to trip his mangled leg, no pitying looks from villagers, and no reminders of the accident that had left him leaning heavily on a polished oak cane. There were only the stars, silent, perfect, and reachable through the glass of his great brass telescope. He was currently hovering over the eyepiece, his fingers dancing across the delicate adjustment knobs with the muscle memory of a man who spent more time looking at the heavens than his own feet. The gears hummed, a soft, rhythmic clicking that filled the circular room. He was tracking a nebula, a faint smudge of violet light that promised to reveal its secrets tonight. Suddenly, the hair on the back of his neck prickled. The observatory was supposed to be empty. The heavy iron door was bolted from the inside, and the only other way in was a sheer drop down the mountainside. Yet the air in the room changed. It grew heavier, carrying the metallic tang of fresh blood and the scent of damp earth, a forest smell that didn't belong at this altitude. Elion started to turn, his cane scraping against the stone floor, but he didn't make it halfway. A shadow detached itself from the curved stone wall near the entrance. It moved with a terrifying, fluid grace that defied its massive size. Before he could even gasp, a calloused, green-skinned hand clamped over his mouth, smelling of iron and sweat. The strength behind it was immense, pinning him effortlessly against the cold brass of the telescope's mounting. Then came the bite of steel, a jagged black iron blade pressed firmly against the soft skin of his throat. The figure behind him was panting, a ragged, wet sound that spoke of exhaustion and a deep, untreated wound. Elion could feel the heat radiating from the stranger's body, a stark contrast to the freezing mountain air. He stayed perfectly still, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird, but his eyes remained fixed on the stars visible through the open dome above. "One sound, stargazer, and the stars are the last thing you'll ever see," a voice rasped in his ear. It was a woman's voice, but it was low and guttural, like stone grinding on stone. Elion didn't struggle. He couldn't. His weak leg began to tremble under the weight of the sudden tension, and he had to lean even harder into the telescope to keep from collapsing. He felt a warm, sticky wetness spreading across the back of his tunic, where his captor was leaning against him. It wasn't his blood. The blade shook slightly against his neck. The orc, for he knew that green skin and that raw power could belong to nothing else, was flagging. Her breathing was becoming a series of harsh, desperate gulps. Outside, the wind howled through the crags, but beneath the wind, Elion heard something else, something rhythmic. The heavy, synchronized thud of boots on the stone path leading up to his door. Many boots. The orc woman stiffened, her grip on his mouth tightening until it bruised. Her head jerked toward the door, her yellow eyes wide with a flicker of something Elion hadn't expected to see in a creature of her kind. Pure, unadulterated terror. She wasn't a raider. She was prey. The pounding at the door began, a violent, demanding sound that echoed through the dome. "Open up, human!" a voice bellowed from the other side, more beast than man. "We know the traitor is here. Deliver her, and we might leave your mountain standing." The orc woman's blade dug a fraction deeper into Elion's skin, drawing a single bead of red. Her eyes met his in the reflection of a nearby glass lens. In that moment, Elion didn't see a monster. He saw a wounded animal backed into a corner, someone who had reached the end of their strength and was waiting for the final blow. He looked from her desperate eyes to the massive hollow base of the ancient telescope beside them. It was a space designed for maintenance, dark and cramped, but large enough to hide a person if they curled tight. The human astronomer, the man the world called broken, made a choice that had nothing to do with logic or survival. He reached up, his hand trembling, and slowly peeled the orc's fingers away from his mouth. She let him, her strength flickering out like a dying candle. "Get inside," he whispered, his voice surprisingly steady as he pointed toward the dark cavity of the telescope's base. She stared at him, her brow furrowed in confusion, the blade still hovering near his chest. "Now," Elion urged, as the wood of the outer door began to splinter under the weight of the hunter's axes. "Unless you want them to find you." With a final, searching look at the frail man, the orc scout sheathed her knife and vanished into the shadows of the brass machine, just as the front door gave way with a deafening crash. Elion took a deep breath, smoothed his tunic over the bloodstain, and leaned heavily on his cane, turning to face the monsters entering his home. The heavy, iron-bound door of the observatory didn't just open. It shattered inward, the ancient wood groaning as it surrendered to the brute force of an axe. Elion didn't flinch, though the vibration traveled up his cane and rattled his teeth. He kept his back to the dark, hollow base of the telescope, where the orc woman was now hidden, her presence reduced to the faint, metallic scent of blood and the sound of shallow, suppressed breathing. The attackers who spilled into the room were a nightmare made of muscle and rusted mail. 3 orcs, larger and more jagged than the woman, their skin a darker, bruised shade of green. They moved with a predatory twitchiness, their eyes scanning the starlit chamber for any sign of their prey. One of them, a massive brute with a facial scar that split his upper lip, stepped forward, his heavy boots grinding glass from a dropped lantern into the stone floor. He sniffed the air, a wet, guttural sound that made Elion's skin crawl. The orc lowered his gore-stained axe, the edge still dripping with something dark, and fixed a yellow, hateful gaze on the astronomer. "Where is she, little human?" the leader growled, his voice a low vibration that seemed to shake the very foundations of the mountain. "The Shadow Scout, the traitor. We tracked her blood to your doorstep." Elion didn't move away. He leaned more heavily on his oak cane, his knuckles white against the wood, and looked the orc in the eye with a level of detachment that seemed to confuse the creature. He didn't look like a man facing a monster. He looked like a man interrupted during a very important calculation. "You've ruined my door," Elion said, his voice thin but remarkably steady in the echoing dome. "It took 3 craftsmen and a team of mules to bring that oak up from the valley. Do you have any idea how difficult it is to get repairs done at this altitude?" The orc leader blinked, his brow furrowing in a display of slow-witted aggression. He took a step closer, the smell of old sweat and raw meat rolling off him in waves. He towered over Elion, a mountain of violence looming over a man who looked like a stiff breeze could knock him over. "I don't care about your door, stargazer," the orc spat, a fleck of yellowish saliva landing on Elion's cheek. "The girl, she came this way. Give her to us, or we'll see if your bones snap as easily as that wood." Elion reached into his pocket with a trembling hand, pulling out a silk handkerchief to slowly wipe his face. He didn't look at the base of the telescope. He didn't look at the bloodstain on the floor that he'd managed to shuffle his feet over. Instead, he looked up at the open slit in the observatory dome, where the violet nebula was still visible, indifferent to the violence below. "A shadow did pass by," Elion said, gesturing vaguely toward the open balcony that overhung the 1,000-foot drop of the north face. "Large, fast, and bleeding quite a lot. She didn't stay to chat. She went over the railing. If she's lucky, she hit a ledge. If not—" He trailed off, giving a small, frail shrug that suggested he found the whole ordeal terribly inconvenient. The orcs exchanged looks. The leader pushed past Elion, his massive shoulder catching the astronomer and nearly sending him sprawling. Elion caught himself on the brass railing of the telescope's mounting, his breath hitching as his bad leg buckled, but he didn't cry out. He watched as the three hunters rushed to the balcony, leaning over the edge to peer into the swirling mists and jagged rocks far below. The wind screamed through the opening, tugging at their furs. "There!" one of the orcs shouted, pointing at a dark shape caught on a crag several 100 feet down. Likely nothing more than a discarded cloak or a trick of the moonlight. "She's dead, or dying," the leader grunted, sounding more annoyed by the loss of a trophy than the death of a comrade. He turned back toward the room, his eyes lingering for a second too long on the massive, silent shape of the telescope. Elion held his breath, his heart hammering a frantic rhythm against his ribs. The orc's gaze swept over the cluttered desks, the star charts, and the dark cavity at the base of the machine. For a heartbeat, the world stood still. Then, with a grunt of disgust, the leader spat on the floor and headed for the ruined door. "Let the crows have her. This place reeks of dust and weakness." Elion waited. He waited until the sound of their heavy boots faded down the stone path, until the wind was the only thing screaming in the night. Only then did he allow himself to collapse into his high-backed chair, his cane clattering to the floor. His hands were shaking so violently he had to tuck them into his sleeves. He sat in the dark for a long time, the only light coming from the stars he loved so much. Finally, a soft scrape of metal on stone came from the base of the telescope. The orc woman, Morven, crawled out from her cramped hiding place. She rose to her full height, her massive frame dwarfing the room now that the other orcs were gone. She was clutching a deep wound in her side, her green skin slick with blood, but her yellow eyes were fixed on Elion with an expression he couldn't quite name. It wasn't the predatory hunger he'd seen before. It was a profound, disoriented shock. "Why?" she rasped, her voice barely a whisper. She looked at the frail man, then at the shattered door, then back at him. "I am your enemy. My kind burns your villages. Why did you lie to the pack?" Elion didn't look up at her. He leaned forward, his eyes fixed on the star charts on his desk. "They were making a mess of my observatory," he said softly, though the tremor in his voice betrayed him. "And I've always found that the stars are much easier to study when there's no one screaming in the room." He paused, then finally looked at her, seeing the way she swayed on her feet from blood loss. "Besides, you looked like you'd had enough of the ground for one night." He reached for a drawer in his desk, pulling out a roll of clean white linen and a small bottle of clear, stinging antiseptic. He didn't offer them with a flourish. He simply set them on the edge of the desk within her reach. "The bandages are clean," he said, his voice regaining its professional, distant edge. "The bottle will hurt. Try not to bleed on the charts. Some of those took years to map." The silence that followed the orc's departure was thick and heavy, like the air before a summer storm. Elion sat in his high-backed chair, the rhythmic ticking of the observatory's many clocks suddenly feeling like the countdown to something he wasn't prepared for. He watched Morven, the orc woman, as she stood by his desk. She looked out of place among the delicate brass instruments and hand-drawn star charts, a creature of raw power and jagged edges in a world of precise measurements and silent light. She stared at the bandages he'd offered as if they were some kind of trap. Her massive hand, stained with the grit of the mountain and her own dark blood, hovered over the white linen. "You should have let them take me," she said, her voice still a low, grinding rasp that seemed to vibrate in the very air. She finally picked up the bandages, her movements hesitant, almost clumsy. "I am a shadow scout. I was trained to move through the night and take what I want. My life is blood and iron. Yours is this." She gestured toward the telescope, her lip curling in a mix of confusion and something that might have been disdain if it weren't for the exhaustion in her eyes. Elion reached for his cane, pulling it close to his side like a familiar friend. "And yet," he said, his voice soft, "you're the one who refused to kill a child. I might spend my life looking at things millions of miles away, but I can still see what's right in front of me." He watched her flinch at his words, the mention of the child she'd been ordered to assassinate hitting her harder than any physical blow. She didn't respond, instead turning her focus to the wound in her side. She tore open her leather vest with a sharp, violent motion, revealing a deep, jagged gash that was weeping fresh blood. The astronomer looked away, his own leg throbbing in sympathy. He knew what it was like to have a body that betrayed you, to feel the world narrowing down to a single point of pain. He stood up, the effort making his breath hitch, and limped toward a small cabinet tucked in the shadows of the curved wall. "The antiseptic will sting," he warned, pulling out a small blue bottle. "But if that wound festers, no amount of hiding in telescopes will save you. The mountain is a harsh host to the sick." Morven didn't move as he approached. She watched him with the wary eyes of a predator, her body tensed as if she expected him to produce a knife instead of a medicine bottle. As he got closer, Elion was struck by the sheer scale of her. Even wounded and hunched over, she was a force of nature. Her skin was a deep, earthy green, mapped with scars that told stories of a life he couldn't begin to imagine. He reached out, his hand trembling slightly as he held the bottle toward her. "I can do it myself," she grunted, snatching the bottle from his hand with a speed that made him blink. She uncorked it with her teeth and poured the liquid directly onto the wound. She didn't scream, didn't even moan. Her only reaction was a sharp intake of breath and a tightening of the muscles in her jaw. She began to wrap the bandages around her waist, her large fingers struggling with the thin, delicate material. Elion watched her for a moment, then sat back down on a stool near the great brass telescope. "You can stay here until you're strong enough to travel," he said, as if he were offering a guest a cup of tea rather than harboring a fugitive of a genocidal war. "The hunters won't come back tonight. They think you're a smear on the rocks below. But the new moon is coming, and they aren't fools. They'll realize I lied sooner or later." Morven finished tying the bandage, her movements becoming more fluid as the initial shock of the antiseptic faded. She looked up at him, her yellow eyes catching the faint glow of the violet nebula through the open dome. "You are a strange human," she said, her voice losing some of its gravelly edge. "Most of your kind would have screamed or begged. You just looked at the sky." "The sky doesn't care about our wars," Elion replied, a small, tired smile touching his lips. "It's been there long before us, and it will be there long after we're gone. When you spend enough time looking at the infinite, the small cruelties of the world start to look very small indeed." He leaned his head back against the cold stone of the wall, the exhaustion of the night finally catching up to him. "Sleep, Scout. There's a cot in the back room. I'll keep watch." Morven didn't move toward the back room. Instead, she sat down on the floor, her back against the base of the telescope where she'd hidden just moments before. She rested her head against the brass, her eyes never leaving Elion. "I don't sleep well in human beds," she whispered. "And I don't need a watcher. I am the shadow." Despite her words, her eyes began to droop, the sheer weight of her injuries and the long night finally pulling her under. Elion watched her until her breathing became slow and deep, a low, rhythmic sound that joined the ticking of the clocks. He sat there in the silence, a crippled man and a monster, both of them survivors in a world that had no place for them, while the stars continued their slow, indifferent dance overhead. The first gray light of dawn began to bleed through the open slit of the observatory dome, turning the deep indigo of the sky into a bruised violet. Elion hadn't slept. He had remained in his chair, his bad leg propped up on a velvet footstool, watching the slow, rhythmic rise and fall of Morven's shoulders. She had fallen into a deep, heavy slumber at the base of the telescope, her hand still resting on the hilt of her jagged blade, even in sleep. It was a strange sight, this engine of war resting in a temple of peace. The contrast was so sharp it felt like a physical weight in the room. When the sun finally crested the distant peaks, painting the stone walls in streaks of gold, Morven's eyes snapped open. There was no slow waking process, no groggy transition. One moment she was dead to the world, and the next she was crouched in a defensive stance, her blade unsheathed and gleaming in the morning light. She scanned the room with a frantic intensity, her nostrils flaring as she caught the scent of the cold mountain air. "They're gone," Elion said quietly, his voice raspy from a night of silence. He didn't move from his chair, knowing that any sudden gesture might trigger her instincts. "The hunters left hours ago. The mountain is quiet." Morven's gaze settled on him, and slowly the tension began to drain from her massive frame. She sheathed her knife with a sharp click and stood up, though she winced as the movement pulled at the fresh bandages on her side. She looked down at the white linen, which was now stained with a dark, dried circle of blood. "You didn't kill me in my sleep," she said, her voice more of a statement than a question. It was an observation of a fact that clearly didn't fit into her understanding of the world. "It's a long walk to the kitchen for a knife," Elion replied, reaching for his cane and pushing himself up from the chair with a grunt of effort. "And as I mentioned, I prefer a quiet observatory. Murder is a very loud business." He limped toward the small stove in the corner, his cane tap-tapping against the stone floor. "I'm going to make some tea, and there's some dried meat and bread if you're hungry. I imagine being hunted across a mountain range works up an appetite." Morven followed him with her eyes, her confusion deepening. In her world, weakness was a death sentence, and mercy was a tactical error. Yet here was this man, a man who walked with a limp and couldn't even stand without a stick, treating her like a guest instead of a monster. She walked over to one of his work tables, her large hands hovering over a delicate brass astrolabe. She didn't touch it, seemingly afraid that her mere presence might shatter the intricate device. "Why do you have all these toys?" she asked, her voice echoing in the circular room. "The clans say humans build walls and cities to hide from the dark. But you build a house with a hole in the roof to look right into it." Elion poured water into a copper kettle, the sound a cheerful splashing in the stillness. "They aren't toys, Morven. They're tools. They help me map the movements of the stars, to understand the patterns of the universe." He turned to look at her, leaning against the counter for support. "The dark isn't something to hide from. It's a canvas. Without the dark, we'd never see the light of things that are much bigger than our little lives." Morven picked up a small hand lens from the table, peering through it at a star chart. Her eyes widened as the tiny, hand-drawn dots of ink suddenly became massive, textured circles. She pulled back, startled, then looked through it again, a flicker of genuine wonder crossing her face. It was the first time Elion had seen her expression soften, the hard mask of the scout slipping just enough to reveal the person beneath the scars. "You see the world through glass," she whispered, setting the lens back down with surprising gentleness. "I see it through the wind and the smell of blood. My people say the stars are the eyes of the ancestors, watching to see if we are strong enough to survive." "And what do you think they see now?" Elion asked, handing her a wooden bowl filled with thick slices of dark bread and salt-cured venison. Morven took the bowl, her fingers brushing against his. Her skin was hot, as if a fire were burning just beneath the surface. She looked at the bread, then up at the telescope, and finally back at Elion. "I think they are as confused as I am, Stargazer," she said, before tearing into the bread with a hunger that was almost feral. As they sat in the morning light, the crippled scholar and the traitorous scout, the observatory felt less like a lonely tower and more like a shared raft in a very vast, very dark sea. The war was still down there. The hunters were still out there. And the prejudices of 1,000 years still stood between them. But for now, there was only the smell of tea, the warmth of the sun, and the strange, fragile peace of two people who had decided, for one night, not to be enemies. The second night in the observatory brought with it a different kind of tension, one that didn't hum with the immediate threat of axes, but with the agonizingly slow process of two worlds grinding against one another. Morven moved through the circular room like a caged leopard, her footsteps silent despite her massive size, while Elian sat at his desk, the scratch of his quill the only other sound. He was trying to focus on his calculations for the upcoming eclipse, but his eyes kept drifting toward the orc woman. She had spent the last hour meticulously cleaning her black iron blade, but every few minutes she would pause to rub her left eye, her jaw tightening in a way that spoke of a deep, sharp pain. Elian finally set his quill down, the ink leaving a small dark blot on the parchment. He could see the irritation even from across the room. The skin around her eye was puffed and angry, a sickly shade of purple beginning to bloom beneath the green. "That's more than just a scratch from the chase, isn't it?" he asked, his voice cutting through the stillness. Morven stopped her wedding stone mid-stroke. She didn't look at him, but her shoulders tensed. "It is a gift from the forest," she rasped, her voice sounding like dry leaves skittering over stone. "A blackthorn splinter. It broke off when I was diving through the thickets to lose the pack. It is nothing. I have survived worse than a bit of wood." "Survivin' and sufferin' are two different things," Elian countered, reaching for his cane and pushing himself to his feet. He limped toward a cabinet filled with small glass vials and metal instruments. "Blackthorn is toxic. If you don't get that splinter out, the swelling will close the eye by morning, and the infection will follow. For a scout, being half-blind is as good as being dead." Morven's hand tightened around the hilt of her knife, her instinct to strike back at any perceived weakness flaring up. But then she looked at Elian, at his bent leg, at the way he leaned so heavily on his stick, and at the calm, unwavering light in his eyes. He wasn't mocking her. He was stating a tactical fact. She let out a long, huffing breath and slumped against the stone wall. "It is deep," she admitted, her voice dropping to a low rumble. "Near the tear duct. I tried to pull it with my fingers, but it is too small, and my hands, they were made for different work." Elian brought a small wooden tray over to the desk, lighting an extra oil lamp to cast a bright, steady glow. On the tray sat a pair of fine silver tweezers and a needle. "Sip," he commanded, gesturing to the heavy chair. Morven hesitated, then lowered her massive frame into the seat, the wood groaning under her weight. Up close, the contrast was even more striking. The delicate, pale hands of the scholar hovering near the scarred, powerful face of the warrior. "You'll have to be very still," Elian whispered, his own heart starting to race. He knew how much power was coiled in the woman before him. If he slipped, if he caused her a sudden spike of pain, her reflex could easily break his neck before she even realized what she was doing. He picked up the tweezers, his fingers trembling slightly. Morven saw the shake in his hands. She looked from the sharp silver tool to his eyes. Then, in a gesture that made Elian's breath hitch, she reached out and took her own jagged black iron knife from her belt. She didn't point it at him. Instead, she turned the hilt toward him and laid the weapon across his lap. It was the ultimate surrender of an orc scout, handing her blade to another. "I trust the man who looks at stars," she said, her yellow eye fixing on his with an intensity that felt like a physical touch. "Do what you must." Elian took a deep breath, forcing the tremor out of his hands. He leaned in, the scent of the forest and iron coming off her in waves. He used his thumb to gently pull back the skin of her eyelid, revealing the tip of a dark, wicked splinter embedded deep in the flesh. Morven didn't blink. She didn't move. She stayed as still as the stone of the mountain itself. With a single, precise motion, Elian clamped the tweezers onto the wood and pulled. A sharp hiss of air escaped Morven's teeth, and her hand gripped the arm of the chair so hard the wood splintered. But she didn't recoil. Elian held up the tweezers, showing her the inch-long black needle of wood he'd extracted. He immediately dabbed the wound with a soothing, cooling salve, his touch light and practiced. "There," he said, his voice returning to its steady, academic tone, though he felt a strange warmth spreading through his chest. "The poison will drain now. You'll be able to see the stars clearly tonight." Morven stayed in the chair for a moment, her eyes slowly blinking as the pressure vanished. She looked at the tiny splinter, then at the man who had removed it. She reached down and took her knife back from his lap, sheathing it with a slow, deliberate motion. She didn't say thank you. That wasn't the way of her people. But as she stood up, she leaned down and placed a hand on Elian's shoulder. It was a heavy, calloused hand, but for the first time it didn't feel like a threat. It felt like an anchor. "The stars are lucky," she whispered, "to have someone like you watching over them." The storm arrived on the third day, not with a sudden crash of thunder, but with a slow, suffocating blanket of white that swallowed the mountain peaks. Elian sat by the small iron stove, the heat from the coals radiating against his aching joints, while the wind shrieked against the stone walls of the observatory. The world outside had vanished, replaced by a swirling void of snow that made the sturdy tower feel like a tiny island in a frozen sea. He stirred a pot of thick oat porridge, the wooden spoon scraping rhythmically against the metal, while Morven sat on the floor across from him. She was sharpening her axe, the rhythmic rasp of the whetstone providing a low, metallic counterpoint to the howling gale. Her movements were slower today, her eye nearly healed, but she kept casting glances toward the heavy, reinforced door that had been crudely patched with planks of wood. The smell of wood smoke and toasted oats filled the room, a domestic scent that felt almost defiant against the backdrop of the blizzard. Elian ladled the porridge into 2 wooden bowls, adding a generous spoonful of honey and a handful of dried berries to each. He limped over to where Morven sat, his cane making a dull thud on the floorboards he'd laid over the stone. He lowered himself onto a low stool, offering her the bowl. Morven took it, her large fingers wrapping around the wood with a gentleness that still seemed to surprise her. She didn't start eating immediately. Instead, she inhaled the steam, her nostrils flaring as she closed her eyes for a brief moment. She looked at the honey swirling into the oats, a luxury she likely hadn't seen in the harsh utilitarian camps of the orc warbands. "The snow will hold for 3 days, Morven said, her voice a low rumble that harmonized with the vibration of the wind. She took a small, hesitant bite of the porridge, her expression shifting as the sweetness hit her tongue. "The paths are gone. Even my kin with their winter blood will not move in this. We are truly alone up here." She looked around the room, her gaze lingering on the shelves of books and the many ticking clocks. "Is it always like this for you, stargazer? This stillness?" She gestured with her spoon at the cozy arrangement of the stove and the chairs. "No drums, no shouting, no smell of the furnace, just the ticking and the wind." Elian nodded, blowing on his own spoonful of porridge. "Usually, yes. It's the price for the view. The stars don't like the noise of the world, so I stay where it is quiet." He watched her eat, noticing how she adjusted her posture to keep the bowl steady, her massive frame taking up nearly a third of the living space. "It's a different kind of life, I suppose. To some, it would feel like a prison." To me, it's the only place I've ever felt like I wasn't just a man with a broken leg. He shifted his weight, his bad leg stretched out toward the warmth of the stove. In the valley, people look at me and see what I can't do. Up here, I am the only one who can read the maps of the sky. The stars don't care if I limp. Morven stopped eating, her spoon hovering near her mouth. She looked at his leg, then back at his face, her yellow eyes searching his. She didn't offer pity. She offered a nod of recognition. Among the clans, if a scout cannot run, they are given the task of the fire keeper. They sit at the heart of the camp and guard the flame that keeps the spirits away. It is not a position of shame. It is a position of trust. She reached out, her hand hovering over the iron stove before she pulled it back. You are the fire keeper of this mountain. You guard the light while the world remains in the dark. The wind slammed into the dome with a force that made the brass telescope vibrate, a low singing note that echoed through the room. Morven didn't flinch. She simply took another bite of her porridge, her body relaxing into the warmth of the small circle they had created around the stove. She reached into a small pouch at her belt and pulled out a piece of polished bone, intricately carved with runes that Elian didn't recognize. She set it on the floor between them, a small token of her own world brought into his. My mother gave me this when I first went into the shadows, she whispered. It is meant to bring the traveler home. But I think, for now, the home is where the smoke is. They sat in silence for a long time, the only sounds being the crackle of the fire and the distant, muted roar of the storm. The observatory, once a cold place of science and solitary study, had transformed. The presence of the orc woman didn't feel like an intrusion anymore. It felt like a completion. As the snow piled up against the door, sealing them in, Elian felt a strange sense of peace. The war was thousands of feet below them, hidden under a shroud of white. Up here there was only the porridge, the warmth, and the quiet company of a woman who had spent her life in the shadows, but was now finding her way toward the light. He reached out and added another log to the fire, the sparks dancing upward like tiny, earthbound stars. The blizzard had finally spent its fury, leaving behind a world muffled in white, and a sky so clear it looked like polished glass. Within the observatory, the air remained warm, though the silence had shifted from the oppressive weight of the storm to something lighter, almost expectant. Morven had grown restless. She was a creature of movement and open spaces, and the stone walls, however welcoming, were starting to feel like a cage. She spent the morning pacing the circumference of the dome, her eyes constantly drawn to the panoramic windows that overlooked the frozen wilderness below. Elian sat at his workbench, his fingers dancing across a set of delicate brass gears. He was working on the tracking mechanism of the telescope, which had been knocked slightly out of alignment during the hunter's intrusion. He watched Morven out of the corner of his eye, seeing the way she checked the tension of her bowstring and the sharpness of her knives for the 10th time that morning. She was a scout who had spent her life navigating the shifting shadows of the forest, and being confined to a single room was clearly taking its toll. You're like a trapped storm, Morven, Elian said softly, not looking up from his work. The mountain isn't going anywhere, and the snow is still too deep for even your kin to traverse easily. Morven stopped her pacing, turning to look at him. Her yellow eyes were bright, reflecting the morning sun. The shadows are calling, stargazer. I've been still for too long. My blood is starting to feel like the ice outside. She walked over to the workbench, her large hands hovering over the intricate gears. You spend your life staring at things that never move, never change. How do you breathe in here? Elian smiled, finally setting down his tools and leaning back in his chair. The stars move constantly, Morven. They dance across the sky in patterns so complex it takes a lifetime to understand them. But I see your point. My world is small, confined by my own limitations. He looked down at his bad leg, which was resting on its usual footstool. I haven't left this peak in 3 years. The ground is difficult for me. A strange look crossed Morven's face, a mix of determination and something that looked almost like mischief. She stepped closer, her massive frame casting a long shadow over the workbench. The ground is only difficult if you have to walk on it yourself, she said, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial rumble. She reached out and grabbed Elion's cane, setting it aside before he could protest. Today you will not be a firekeeper. You will be a scout. Before Elion could ask what she meant, Morven moved with a speed that defied her size. She reached down and scooped him up, hoisting him onto her broad shoulders as easily as if he were a child. Elion gasped, his hands instinctively grabbing onto her thick, braided hair to keep his balance. He was suddenly 6 feet higher than he had ever been, the room tilting dangerously before stabilizing as Morven adjusted her stance. "Morven, what are you doing?" he managed to choke out, his heart hammering against his ribs. "I can't." "We can't go out there." "I am a shadow scout of the Iron Grip clan," Morven declared, her voice filled with a sudden, fierce joy. "I have carried full-grown warriors through the marshes of the Black Reach. You weigh no more than a bundle of dry wood." She walked toward the heavy, patched door, her stride confident and powerful despite the weight. "The sun is out, the wind is dead, and there is something I want to show you. Something you can't see through your glass tubes." She pushed open the door, and the cold mountain air hit them like a physical blow, crisp and invigorating. The world was a blinding expanse of white, the snow piled high against the stone walls of the observatory. Morven didn't hesitate. She stepped into the drifts, her powerful legs driving through the snow with an effortless grace that Elion could only watch in awe. He felt the ripple of her muscles beneath him, the sheer vitality of her body as she navigated the treacherous terrain. They moved away from the tower, heading toward a sheltered cove on the northern side of the peak. Morven moved with a predator's instinct, finding the firmest ground beneath the snow and avoiding the hidden crevices that would have swallowed a man whole. As they moved, the fear that had initially gripped Elion began to fade, replaced by a sense of wonder. For the first time in years, he wasn't looking at the world from a distance. He was in it. He felt the spray of snow against his face, the scent of frozen pine needles, and the immense, silent power of the mountain. "Look there," Morven whispered, slowing her pace as they reached the edge of a deep, rocky hollow. In the center of the hollow, sheltered from the wind by a massive overhang of stone, a cluster of strange, pale flowers had pushed their way through the snow. They were crystalline in appearance, their petals translucent and shimmering with a faint, ethereal light. They shouldn't have been able to survive in such a harsh environment. Yet there they were, blooming in the heart of winter. "Frost lilies," Morven said, her voice soft with reverence. "My people say they only bloom when the mountain is at its coldest. They are the eyes of the earth, watching for the return of the sun." Elion looked at the flowers, then up at the vast blue sky, and finally at the woman who was carrying him. He realized then that he had spent so much time looking for beauty in the infinite that he had forgotten to look for it at his feet. The stars were magnificent, but they were cold and distant. This, the warmth of Morven's shoulders, the scent of the lilies, and the shared silence of the mountain was something entirely different. It was a beauty that could be felt, a beauty that made the ground seem a lot less like a place of pain and a lot more like a place of belonging. The return to the observatory was quieter than the departure, the exhilaration of the mountain air settling into a deep, comfortable fatigue. Morven set Elion back into his cushioned chair with the same careful precision she used when sheathing her weapons, her breathing only slightly faster than usual despite the grueling trek through the snow. She didn't move away immediately, standing over him for a moment with her hands on her hips, looking down at the man who had seen the frost lilies. The room felt different now. The brass and glass were no longer just instruments of cold calculation, but the anchors of a sanctuary that had survived the storm. Helion reached for his tea, which had grown cold, but he didn't care. The memory of the shimmering petals in the snow felt like a secret fire in his chest. Morven began to unstrap her heavy leather pauldrons, the thick hide creaking as she worked the buckles. She didn't look like a shadow scout in this moment. She looked like a traveler who had finally found a hearth worth tending. She moved to the center of the room, where the great brass telescope stood like a silent sentinel. "Your eyes are different, stargazer," she remarked, her voice a low, melodic rumble that seemed to harmonize with the ticking clocks. "You look at the walls as if you are seeing them for the first time. Perhaps the mountain air cleared the dust from your glass." She picked up a discarded rag and began to polish a smudge on the telescope's mounting, her movements rhythmic and surprisingly delicate. Helion watched her, his fingers tracing the rim of his wooden cup. He noticed the way the fading sunlight caught the green of her skin, turning it into the color of deep moss and ancient forests. The contrast between her warrior's physique and the domestic task she had set for herself was a sight he found more compelling than any nebula. "I think I spent too much time looking through the lens and not enough time looking at what the lens was sitting on," he admitted, his voice soft. He set his cup aside and reached for a small, leather-bound notebook, flipping through pages filled with star charts and mathematical proofs. He hesitated, then tore out a blank page and picked up a charcoal pencil. As Morven continued to polish the brass, Helion began to draw. His hands, usually so steady with a compass or a slide rule, moved with a new kind of fluidity. He wasn't mapping the sky, he was mapping the woman. He sketched the strong line of her jaw, the way her hair fell in thick, dark braids over her shoulders, and the curious, almost tender expression she wore when she looked at his instruments. He captured the jagged scar on her collarbone, and the way her yellow eyes seemed to hold the light of a dozen hidden suns. He worked in silence, the only sound the soft scratch of charcoal on paper, and the distant moan of the wind against the dome. Morven noticed his activity but didn't interrupt. She seemed to understand the gravity of the moment, the way he was translating his experience of her into the language he knew best. She shifted her weight, posing almost unconsciously, her gaze fixed on the violet nebula that was starting to reappear in the darkening sky. She looked like a statue of a forgotten goddess, a being of earth and shadow, captured in a moment of rare, fragile peace. When Helion finally finished, he looked at the drawing and felt a jolt of recognition. It wasn't just a likeness. It was a testament to the fact that his world had expanded far beyond the reach of his telescope. He held the paper out toward her, his hand steady. Morven stopped her polishing and walked over, her heavy boots thudding softly on the floor. She took the sketch, her eyes widening as she saw herself through his eyes. She didn't speak for a long time, her thumb tracing the charcoal lines of her own face. A faint flush of color, a darker shade of green, crept into her cheeks. "You see me," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Not a scout, not a monster, just me." She looked up at him, and for the first time Helion saw a flicker of something that wasn't just trust or gratitude. It was a deep, soul-shaking warmth. The night began to pull its velvet curtain over the mountain, and the first stars started to prick through the indigo. Morven carefully folded the sketch and tucked it into the inner lining of her vest, right over her heart. She didn't go back to the base of the telescope to sleep. Instead, she brought a heavy fur rug over to the stove and sat down next to Helion's chair. She leaned her head against the side of his seat, her presence a solid, grounding weight in the dark. Helion reached out and placed a hand on her shoulder, his fingers brushing against the rough leather of her vest. They sat together in the starlight, a crippled man and an orc scout, watching the heavens not as subjects to be studied, but as a shared home. The world below was still full of fire and iron, but up here, in the cold, quiet heights, They had found a light that no storm could ever blow out. The rhythm of their shared life within the stone walls of the observatory began to settle into a quiet, domestic dance. Morven's physical strength returned with a speed that fascinated Elian. The deep gash in her side had closed into a thick, silver-green ridge of scar tissue, and the puffiness around her eye had vanished, leaving her gaze sharper than ever. She no longer spent her hours pacing like a trapped animal. Instead, she had begun to claim small corners of the circular room as her own, arranging her sharpened gear with a meticulous care that mirrored Elian's organization of his star charts. She had taken to helping with the heavy labor of the tower, hauling the massive iron water buckets from the snowmelt cistern and moving heavy crates of astronomical equipment that Elian usually had to struggle with for hours. One evening, as the shadows of the instruments grew long and spindly against the floor, Morven approached the small kitchen area. Elian was leaning over a pot of stew, his face flushed from the steam and the heat of the stove. His bad leg was clearly bothering him. He kept shifting his weight, his knuckles white where they gripped the handle of his cane. Morven didn't say a word. She simply reached out and took the heavy wooden ladle from his hand. Her fingers brushed his, the warmth of her skin a steady contrast to the chill that always seemed to linger in his joints. She moved him aside with a gentle nudge of her hip, stepping into the space before the stove. "You are good with the glass and the ink, stargazer," she said, her voice a low, pleasant rumble. "But you stir the pot like you are afraid the vegetables will bite back." She began to move the ladle in slow, powerful circles, her eyes fixed on the bubbling liquid. "In the camps, the stew is thick enough to hold a spear upright. It is not about the taste. It is about the fire it puts in the belly before a raid." She reached into her belt pouch and pulled out a handful of dried, pungent herbs that smelled of pine and sharp earth. She crumbled them into the pot with a practiced flick of her wrist. "These will help. They are from the low valleys. They wake up the blood." Elian sat on his stool, letting out a long, shaky breath as the pressure left his leg. He watched her work, amazed at how naturally she had assumed the role of provider. She moved with a strange, fluid economy, her massive hands surprisingly deft as she sliced bread and arranged bowls. The scent of the herbs began to fill the room, a wild, spicy aroma that cut through the dusty smell of old parchment and brass. It felt as though a piece of the untamed forest had been brought inside, warming the cold stone in a way the coal fire never could. "I didn't think orcs cared much for culinary arts," Elian remarked, a small smile playing on his lips as he watched her taste the stew. Morven snorted, a sound of genuine amusement that vibrated in her chest. "We are not the mindless beasts your books say we are. We eat, we sleep, and we care for our kin. A warrior who is hungry is a warrior who makes mistakes." She ladled the thick, dark stew into their bowls, the steam rising in swirling patterns. She handed him his portion, her yellow eyes catching the glow of the oil lamp. "Eat. You are too thin, like a winter-starved deer. How can you hold up the sky if you have no weight to your bones?" They ate in a comfortable silence, the stew rich and complex in a way Elian had never managed on his own. The herbs Morven had added provided a lingering heat that seemed to seep directly into his aching hip, numbing the sharp edges of his chronic pain. He felt a sudden, profound sense of gratitude, not just for the food, but for the sheer presence of her. For years, this observatory had been a place of isolation, a tower where he watched the world from a safe, lonely distance. Now, it was a home. The sound of her eating, the solid weight of her across the table, and the shared warmth of the meal made the vast, empty sky outside seem a little less intimidating. As they finished, Morven reached out and took his empty bowl, stacking it with her own. She looked at the great brass telescope, then back at him. "The sky is clear tonight," she noted, her voice softening. "The stars are waiting for their keeper. Go. I will handle the grease and the water. My hands are made for the heavy work." She didn't wait for his permission, turning back to the stove to start the cleaning. Elion stood up, his leg feeling stronger than it had in days. He limped toward his telescope, but as he looked up at the stars, he realized he wasn't just looking for distant galaxies anymore. He was looking at the world with the eyes of someone who finally had something worth protecting on the ground. The cold brilliance of the heavens was still there, but the real warmth was behind him, in the rhythmic scraping of a wooden ladle and the steady breathing of a woman who had taught him that even a broken man could find a place in the light. The peace of the high mountain was shattered on the 7th morning after the storm, not by the wind, but by the sharp, rhythmic clinking of metal against stone. Elion was hunched over a delicate brass clockwork mechanism when the sound first reached his ears, a faint metallic tapping that felt entirely wrong in the natural silence of the peak. Across the room, Morven froze mid-motion as she was tightening the straps on her boots. She didn't look at the door. She looked at the heavy iron axe leaning against the wall, her nostrils flaring as she caught a scent on the air that Elion's human nose couldn't yet detect. She was across the room in 3 long, silent strides, her hand closing around the hilt of her weapon. "They are back," she whispered, her voice a low, dangerous vibration that made the glass of the telescope hum. "And they aren't hiding their tracks this time." Elion reached for his cane, his knuckles turning white as he pushed himself upright. He moved to the narrow window slit that faced the southern approach. Far below, winding up the treacherous, ice-slicked path he had watched Morven conquer days before, was a line of dark shapes. They were moving with a disciplined, military precision that the first group of hunters had lacked. These weren't just ragged trackers. They were a specialized recovery squad. Sunlight glinted off the polished surfaces of heavy crossbows and the serrated edges of black iron pole arms. There were 6 of them, led by an orc whose armor was etched with the crimson sigil of the High Guard. He didn't look like he was hunting for sport. He looked like he was completing a grim, inevitable task. Morven stepped up behind Elion, her presence a wall of heat and tension. She looked over his shoulder at the approaching squad, her jaw tightening so hard the muscles in her neck stood out like cords. "The High Guard," she rasped, her thumb unconsciously tracing the jagged edge of her axe. "They don't leave survivors, Stargazer. If they find me here, they will burn this tower to the bedrock, just to make sure the secret I carry dies with me." She turned toward the center of the room, her eyes darting between the heavy iron door and the narrow balcony. The panic wasn't in her voice, but in the frantic, sharp way she checked the tension of her bowstring. "You have to give me up. Tell them I broke in, that I held you hostage." "They might let you live if they think you were a victim." Elion turned to face her, leaning heavily on his cane as his bad leg began to throb with the cold of the mountain. He didn't look at the door or the approaching killers. He looked at the green-skinned woman who had shared his bread, healed his aching joints with her forest herbs, and carried him through the snow to see the flowers. He saw the small, folded charcoal sketch peeking out from the edge of her vest. He reached out and placed his hand over hers on the axe handle. His touch was light, almost frail compared to her massive strength, but it was unwavering. "I am a man of the stars, Morven. I spent my life looking for things that are constant, things that don't flicker or fade when the wind blows." He gestured toward the telescope, then back to her. "I don't betray the things I've finally found." He limped toward the heavy, iron-bound door, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. The sound of the boots was closer now, a heavy, rhythmic thudding that shook the stone floor. Elion didn't reach for a weapon. He didn't have one. Instead, he pulled a heavy iron bar across the door, the metal groaning as it settled into its brackets. He turned back to Morven, who was standing in the center of the room, her axe raised, and her eyes wide with a mixture of terror and fierce, blossoming loyalty. "The base of the telescope," Elion commanded, his voice surprisingly firm. "Get back inside." They will have to break me before they get to the hatch. Morven shook her head, her braids whipping around her face. I won't let you die for me, Stargazer. You are a man of peace. You don't know how they kill. She stepped toward him, intending to shove him aside and face her kin. But Elion didn't move. He stood his ground, his cane planted firmly on the floor, his eyes locking onto hers with a quiet, stubborn power that stopped her in her tracks. They expect a coward, Elion whispered as the first heavy blow struck the outer wood of the door, making the entire observatory shudder. They expect a man who values his life more than his honor. Let them find a mountain instead. He watched as the realization dawned on her, the way her grip on the axe shifted from aggression to a desperate, protective instinct. With a final, agonized look, she ducked her head and vanished into the dark cavity of the telescope's base, just as the iron hinges of the door began to scream under the pressure of a massive ram. Elion smoothed his tunic, leaned his weight onto his cane, and stared at the splintering wood, his hands trembling but his gaze fixed on the entrance, like a man watching the inevitable transit of a star. The first cracks appeared in the oak, and the smell of rusted iron and bloodlust spilled into his sanctuary. But Elion didn't look away. He stood in the center of his world, a crippled guardian of a secret that was worth more than his own survival. The iron bar groaned as it absorbed the impact of a heavy, metal-shod ram, the sound vibrating through the stone floor and rattling the delicate glass lenses on the shelves. Elion gripped his cane, the wood biting into his palm as the door shuddered again, the oak beginning to splinter around the hinges. He stood in the center of the room, his bad leg locked at the knee to keep from buckling, his gaze fixed on the widening cracks. With a final, deafening crash, the bar snapped and the door flew inward, rebounding against the stone wall with a clang that echoed through the dome like a funeral bell. 6 massive figures surged into the room, their heavy boots grinding into the wood debris. They moved with a predatory efficiency, fanning out to encircle the astronomer, their black iron polearms leveled at his chest. At the center of the group stood the High Guard commander, a towering orc with a face mapped by jagged scars and eyes as cold as the mountain's permafrost. He wore a mantle of thick, dark fur over his plate armor, and the crimson sigil on his chest seemed to glow in the morning light. He took a slow step forward, the tip of his serrated blade stopping just inches from Elion's throat. The commander's gaze swept the room, lingering on the massive brass telescope and the scattered star charts before returning to the frail man standing before him. He didn't speak immediately, instead sniffing the air with a wet, guttural noise that made his scarred nostrils flare. The scent of wood smoke, old parchment, and the lingering metallic tang of Morven's blood filled the small space. "You are a long way from the safety of the valleys, Stargazer," the commander growled, his voice a deep, resonant rumble that felt like a physical weight. He gestured with his free hand toward the blood-stained floor near the telescope base, where a few dark droplets remained visible despite Elion's attempts to shuffle them away. "We tracked a shadow scout to this peak, a traitor who carries the secrets of the High Command. She did not fall from the cliffs, and she did not vanish into the mists. My trackers say she entered this tower." He leaned in closer, the smell of rusted iron and stale sweat rolling off him. "Tell me where the filth is hiding, or I will peel the skin from your fingers one by one to see if you bleed ink or blood." Elion didn't flinch, though the cold steel of the blade was close enough to prick his skin. He adjusted his weight on his cane, the movement slow and deliberate. "I told the first group of your hunters that she went over the railing," he said, his voice thin but remarkably steady in the tense silence. "I have no reason to change my story for you, regardless of how much iron you carry." He looked past the commander toward the balcony, where the sun was now high and bright. "The mountain takes what it wants. If your scout is missing, she belongs to the rocks now." The commander's eyes narrowed, his jaw tightening as he sensed the lie. He didn't roar or strike. He simply nodded to his men. Two of the guards broke rank and began to systematically ransack the observatory. They overturned heavy desks, spilling ink and parchment across the floor, and smashed delicate brass instruments with the butts of their polearms. One of them approached the base of the telescope, his heavy boot kicking at the hollow brass mounting. Elion's hand tightened on his cane until his knuckles turned white, but he remained motionless, his eyes fixed on the commander's scarred face. The guard reached the maintenance hatch at the base of the telescope and paused, his hand going to the latch. Elion felt his heart hammer a frantic rhythm against his ribs, a cold sweat breaking out across his forehead. He took a sudden, limping step forward, his cane clicking sharply on the stone. "That machine is calibrated to the 1,000th of an inch," he snapped, his voice cracking with a forced, academic outrage. "If you disturb the counterweights, the entire mechanism will collapse, and you'll have several tons of brass and glass crushed onto your head." The guard hesitated, looking back at the commander for instructions. The commander stared at Elion, searching for a flicker of fear in his eyes. For a long, agonizing moment, the only sound was the ticking of a clock that had survived the destruction. Then, with a grunt of annoyance, the commander waved the guard away from the hatch. "Leave it." If she were inside that tin tube, she would have suffocated by now. He turned back to Elion, his blade dropping slightly. "You are either a very brave man or a very foolish one, Stargazer. But I do not have time for your riddles. We will search the perimeter. If we find even a scrap of her cloak on your rocks, I will come back and ensure you never see the stars again." The squad turned as one, their heavy movements shaking the room as they marched back through the ruined door. The commander stayed behind for a second longer, his yellow eyes boring into Elion's with a lingering suspicion. He spat on the floor at Elion's feet and then vanished into the bright glare of the snow outside. Elion waited, his body trembling with the sudden release of adrenaline. He listened until the sound of their boots faded into the distance, until the only sound was the whistling of the wind through the broken doorway. He didn't move for several minutes, his breath coming in ragged, shallow gasps. Finally, he limped over to the telescope and tapped 3 times on the brass casing. The hatch creaked open, and Morven tumbled out, her face pale under her green skin and her eyes wide with a mixture of terror and fierce, wordless gratitude. She looked at the wreckage of his home, the broken glass, the spilled ink and the shattered desk, and then at the frail man who had stood between her and the high guard. She didn't say thank you. She simply reached out and gripped his hand, her touch so strong it bruised, as if she were anchoring herself to the only thing in the world that made sense. The shattered ruins of the observatory door allowed a biting draft to whistle through the room, stirring the pages of ruined star charts that lay scattered across the floor like the wings of fallen birds. Elion stood amidst the wreckage of his life's work, his breath hitching as he leaned his full weight onto his cane. The adrenaline that had sustained him through the confrontation with the high guard was receding, leaving a hollow, aching exhaustion in its wake. He looked at the heavy brass instruments he had spent years calibrating, now lying bent and useless under the weight of orc boots. Morven stepped out from the telescope shadow, her presence filling the broken room. She didn't look at the damage with the detached curiosity of a scout. She looked at it with a raw, bleeding guilt that she couldn't hide. She moved toward a smashed table, her large hand hovering over a shattered glass lens that had once mapped the moons of Jupiter. "This was your world," she whispered, her voice cracking like dry wood. "They broke your world because of me. You should have given me to them, Stargazer. A machine of stars is worth more than a machine of war." She reached out to touch his shoulder, but pulled back at the last second, her fingers trembling as if she feared her very touch might cause more destruction. Elion didn't look at the broken glass. He looked at her, seeing the way her yellow eyes were clouded with a grief he had never seen in her kind. He reached out and grabbed her hand, pulling it toward him. His grip was surprisingly strong for a man so frail. "The glass can be reground, Morven. The brass can be straightened. But a choice once made is the only thing in this universe that truly lasts." He gestured toward the open dome, where the midday sun was casting long, harsh shadows across the debris. "They didn't break my world. They just made it a bit messier. My world isn't in these tubes or papers anymore." He let go of her hand and limped toward the small kitchen corner, which had miraculously escaped the worst of the ransacking. He picked up a fallen kettle, the metal dented but still functional. "We need to clear the doorway. The cold will settle into the stone if we don't block the wind. And then we are going to eat. I believe there is still some of that stew left, and I refuse to let the high guard ruin my appetite along with my furniture." Morven didn't move for a long moment, her gaze fixed on the broken door. Then, with a sudden sharp exhale, she set her jaw and moved toward the entrance. She didn't use a tool. She simply gripped the heavy, splintered remains of the oak door and hoisted them back into the frame with a grunt of immense effort. She worked with a silent, focused intensity, using her dagger to shave down the warped edges until the wood fit snugly enough to keep out the worst of the chill. As she worked, she kept glancing back at Elion, as if checking to make sure he hadn't vanished or collapsed. Every time their eyes met, she saw the same quiet, stubborn calm in his face. And slowly, the tension in her own shoulders began to ease. She wasn't a fugitive in this moment. She was a partner in a rebuilding project that had nothing to do with war. Once the door was temporarily secured with a heavy iron latch she'd hammered back into shape, Morven turned her attention to the rest of the room. She moved through the wreckage like a green whirlwind, righting overturned bookshelves and stacking the salvaged papers into neat piles. She picked up a heavy lead weight that had been used for the telescope's tracking system and set it back on its pedestal with a rhythmic thud. Elion watched her from his stool by the stove, the smell of warming stew beginning to drift through the air again. He felt a strange sense of contentment. The observatory was a mess. His instruments were damaged, and a squad of elite killers was roaming the mountain below, but the hearth was warm, and he wasn't alone. He reached for his notebook, which Morven had placed gently on the table before him. The cover was scuffed, and the spine was cracked, but the pages inside, the maps of the heavens and the sketch of the woman, were intact. They sat down to eat as the sun began its long descent toward the western peaks, painting the snow outside in shades of pink and gold. The stew was just as rich as it had been the night before, the herbs providing a lingering warmth that settled deep into Elion's bones. Morven ate with a quiet, reflective pace, her eyes constantly roaming the room, as if she were memorizing the placement of every chair and every book. "The High Guard will not go far," she said suddenly, her voice a low rumble. "They will camp at the base of the pass. They are waiting to see if I am flushed out by the cold or the hunger." She looked at Elion, her expression turning somber. "I cannot stay here forever, Stargazer. I am a shadow that brings the lightning. Eventually the lightning will hit this tower again." Elion set his spoon down, looking at the steam rising from his bowl. He knew she was right. The peace they had found was a fragile thing, held together by snow and silence. But he didn't feel the fear he expected to feel. He felt a profound, quiet strength. "Then we will enjoy the silence while it lasts," he said, his voice firm. "The stars don't stop shining just because a storm is coming. They just wait for the clouds to pass." He reached across the table and placed his hand over hers. The contrast between his pale skin and her deep green hide, a testament to the strange, beautiful logic of the mountain. "You taught me how to see the flowers in the snow, Morven. Let me teach you how to wait for the morning." She didn't pull away. She turned her hand over, interlacing her thick fingers with his. And for the first time since the door had shattered, the silence in the observatory felt like a promise instead of a threat. The temperature inside the observatory dropped sharply as the sun dipped behind the jagged spine of the northern range, casting the room into a deep, crystalline blue. Despite the repairs to the door, a persistent draft hissed through the gaps, carrying the scent of dry ice and high-altitude stone. Morven spent the evening sharpening her tools by the fading light of the stove, the rhythmic rasp of her whetstone providing a steady heartbeat to the quiet. She paused frequently, her head cocking toward the reinforced door, her large ears twitching at the sound of the shifting snow outside. Every time the wind howled or a timber groaned under the cold, her hand drifted toward the hilt of her axe. Elion watched her from his seat at the drafting table, the golden light of a single oil lamp reflecting off his spectacles. He didn't offer words of comfort. Instead, he reached for a small cedar box he kept hidden beneath a stack of star charts. He opened it, revealing several sticks of dried incense, the expensive, resinous kind made from valley cedar and lavender. He placed a stick in a small brass burner, the fragrant blue smoke curling upward into the dome. The scent began to mask the metallic tang of the orc's gear and the scorched smell of the stove, replacing it with something soft and nostalgic. Morven's shoulders, which had been hunched in a defensive posture for hours, slowly began to lower. She inhaled deeply, her nostrils flaring as she looked at the thin ribbon of smoke. "It smells like the old forests," she remarked, her voice a low, gravelly hum that seemed to vibrate in the floorboards. "Before the fires. Before the ironworks." She set her whetstone aside and walked over to the desk, her movement silent despite her bulk. She reached out a finger, hovering it near the rising smoke, watching it coil around her green skin. She looked at Elion, her expression softened by the amber light. "You have a way of making the air feel different, stargazer. Even with a pack of killers at the bottom of the hill, you sit here and burn flowers." Elion gave a small, tired smile, his fingers tracing the edge of a brass compass. "The flowers are easier to handle than the killers, Morven. And I've found that when the world outside gets too loud, you have to create your own quiet." He gestured to a space on the rug near the stove, where he had laid out a thick wool blanket. "The High Guard won't move in the dark. They value their lives too much to navigate the ice falls at night. Sit. Rest your eyes." "You've been watching the door for 6 hours." Morven hesitated, her eyes flickering toward the dark entrance one last time before she surrendered to the warmth. She sat on the floor, her massive frame taking up most of the rug, her back resting against the stone base of the telescope. She didn't lie down. She sat with her legs crossed, her axe resting across her lap, a guardian even in her moments of peace. As the night deepened, the silence between them became a bridge. Elion didn't return to his calculations. He picked up his charcoal pencil and a fresh sheet of parchment, but instead of drawing her, he began to sketch the intricate patterns of the cedar smoke as it drifted through the room. Morven watched his hand move, her yellow eyes following the fluid, precise strokes. "You see things that others ignore," she said, her voice dropping to a whisper that was almost a purr. "The way the light hits the glass, the way the smoke curls. My people only see the path ahead or the enemy in front of them. We don't look at the smoke unless there's a fire to put out." She reached out and touched the edge of the parchment, her calloused thumb brushing against the charcoal. "It's a strange kind of strength to notice the small things when the big things are trying to break you." Elion paused, looking at her over the top of his spectacles. He saw the way the lantern light caught the scars on her face, turning them into a road map of a life spent in conflict. "It's the only strength I have, Morven. I can't run, and I can't fight. All I can do is observe. And I've observed that you are much more than the shadow scout you were trained to be." He set the pencil down and leaned back, his bad leg throbbing with a dull, manageable ache. "You saved that child. and you chose to hide here instead of taking what you needed by force. Those aren't the actions of a monster." Morven didn't respond immediately. She looked into the glowing embers of the stove, her face unreadable. Then she reached into her vest and pulled out the folded sketch Elion had drawn of her. She didn't unfold it, but she held it with a gentleness that was profoundly touching. The observatory felt like a bubble of warmth in a frozen universe. Outside, the stars were cold and indifferent. But inside, the air was thick with the scent of cedar and the steady breathing of two people who had found a reason to hope. Morven eventually leaned her head back against the telescope, her eyes closing as the warmth of the stove finally overcame her vigilance. She didn't fall into the jagged, alert sleep of a soldier. Her breathing deepened, and her grip on the axe loosened just enough for the handle to tilt toward the floor. Elion stayed awake for a long time, watching her. He realized that the observatory was no longer a place of solitude, but a sanctuary of contrasts. He reached out and adjusted the blanket around her shoulders, his touch light and cautious. The mountain was still dangerous, and the morning would bring new threats, but for now the smoke was sweet, and the world was quiet. He rested his head on his hand, the ticking of the clocks lulling him into a soft, dreamless state, content to be the watcher of the woman who had brought the forest to his frozen peak. The pre-dawn light was a thin, ghostly silver that seeped through the cracks of the patch door, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the frigid air. Morven was already awake, her body coiled like a spring as she knelt by the stone hearth. She wasn't stoking the fire for warmth. She was systematically packing her gear, her movements silent and practiced. She checked the fletching on her arrows, ran a thumb over the edge of her axe, and then began to wrap her feet in fresh strips of heavy wool. Elion watched her from the shadows of his high-backed chair, his bad leg propped up on the velvet stool. The silence in the observatory was heavy, no longer the cozy quiet of shared tea, but the sharp, ringing stillness that precedes a departure. He reached for his oak cane, the wood cold against his palm, and pushed himself upward with a stifled grunt. Morven turned her head at the sound, her yellow eyes catching the faint glint of the dying embers. She stood up, her massive frame dwarfing the room once more, now draped in her weathered leather armor and travel furs. She looked at the telescope, then at the shattered desk she had helped him tidy, and finally at Elion. She didn't move toward him. Instead, she reached into her vest and pulled out the small, folded charcoal sketch. She looked at it for a long heartbeat before tucking it back into the secret pocket near her heart. "The wind has shifted, stargazer," she said, her voice a low, gravelly rasp that seemed to catch in her throat. "The High Guard will move at first light. They will expect me to head for the pass. But I know the hidden veins of this mountain, the paths where the snow doesn't settle because of the heat from the earth deep below." She took a step toward him, her heavy boots silent on the rug. "I cannot stay. To stay is to bring the fire back to your door, and you have already lost enough glass for my sake." Elion limped toward her, his cane tap-tapping a slow rhythm on the stone. He stopped just inches away, looking up at the woman who had transformed his lonely tower into a home. He reached into the pocket of his tunic and pulled out a small, heavy object wrapped in silk. He held it out to her, his hands steady despite the chill. When Morven unwrapped it, her eyes widened. It was a brass pocket sextant, an antique instrument of exquisite craftsmanship, etched with the constellations of the northern hemisphere. The glass was polished to a mirror finish, and the needle vibrated with a life of its own. "Take it," Elion whispered, his voice thin but firm. "It won't tell you where the enemy is, but it will tell you where you are. As long as you can see a single star through the canopy or the clouds, you'll never truly be lost." Morven stared at the instrument, her large fingers trembling as she touched the cold brass. She didn't ask how much it was worth, or how he had come by it. She simply closed her hand around it, the metal disappearing into her palm. She reached out with her other hand and placed it on Elion's shoulder, her grip firm and lingering. The heat from her body radiated through his thin wool tunic, a stark reminder of the vitality she had brought into his life. "In my world, we do not have words for this," she said, her eyes searching his face. "But the Shadow Scouts have a saying. The stars guide the path, but the fire keeps the soul." "You are the fire, Elion." She leaned down, her forehead briefly touching his in a gesture of profound, wordless respect that made his breath hitch. The first rays of the sun struck the peak, turning the snow outside into a field of diamonds. Morven stepped toward the door, her hand on the iron latch. She didn't look back. She knew that if she did, the mountain might become a prison she never wanted to leave. She pulled the door open, and the freezing air rushed in, swirling the incense smoke into a chaotic dance. She stepped out into the blinding white, her dark silhouette standing out against the pristine snow. With a sudden, fluid motion, she broke into a run, her powerful legs eating up the distance as she headed toward the jagged northern ridges. Elion stood in the doorway, leaning heavily on his cane, watching until she was nothing more than a speck of shadow against the vast, indifferent landscape. He stayed there until his breath began to frost his spectacles and his bad leg turned numb with the cold. The observatory behind him felt cavernous and empty, the ticking of the clocks suddenly sounding like the heartbeat of a ghost. He turned back inside, the smell of cedar and orc musk still lingering in the air. He walked to the telescope, his fingers tracing the brass mounting where she had hidden, and then he looked up through the open dome. The stars were gone, swallowed by the brilliance of the day, but Elion didn't feel the old loneliness. He sat at his desk, picked up a fresh sheet of parchment, and began to write. He wasn't recording a transit or a nebula. He was recording the coordinates of a hidden cove where the frost lilies grew, and the memory of a woman who had taught a crippled man that the ground was just as beautiful as the sky. The mountain was silent again, but the silence had changed. It was no longer a void, but a vessel, holding the warmth of a fire that would never truly go out. The weeks that Morven's departure were the quietest Elion had ever known. Yet the observatory no longer felt like a tomb of cold brass and dead silence. He moved through his daily routines with a new, deliberate rhythm, his bad leg still aching in the frost, but his movements possessing a steady purpose. He spent his mornings clearing the last of the debris from the High Guard's raid, painstakingly polishing the scratches out of the mahogany desks and reorganizing his scattered star charts. The mountain air remained biting, but he kept the iron stove stoked with a fierce, crackling fire, the scent of wood smoke acting as a constant reminder of the nights spent sharing stew and stories. He often found his gaze drifting toward the northern ridges, tracing the invisible paths through the snow where a shadow might have passed. But he never let his focus waver from the tasks at hand. He was the firekeeper of the peak, and he had a duty to the light. One afternoon, a heavy thud sounded against the reinforced door, followed by the familiar, rhythmic scrape of metal on stone. Elion froze, his hand tightening on his oak cane, his heart performing a sudden, erratic dance against his ribs. He didn't reach for a weapon. Instead, he smoothed his tunic and limped toward the entrance, his breath hitching as he pulled back the heavy iron bar. When the door swung open, he didn't find a squad of hunters or a wounded scout. Instead, he found a massive, woven basket sitting on the threshold, overflowing with bundles of aromatic valley herbs, cured meats wrapped in thick leaves, and a heavy, sealed jar of wild mountain honey. Tied to the handle of the basket was a small, familiar piece of silk, the wrapping from the sextant he had given her. There was no note, no signature, and no tracks leading away into the fresh powder of the morning's snowfall. Elion hauled the basket inside, the weight of it straining his arms but warming his spirit. He spent the evening arranging the gifts on his shelves, the room soon filling with the sharp, wild scent of the low valleys. He opened the jar of honey, the golden liquid thick and sweet, tasting of summer and hidden meadows. As he ate a simple meal of bread and honey by the glow of the stove, he looked at the great brass telescope. It was back in its proper alignment now, its lenses gleaming and its gears humming with a smooth, rhythmic precision. He climbed the small ladder to the eyepiece, his bad leg protesting the incline, and peered into the deep indigo void. He didn't look for the violet nebula or the moons of Jupiter. He looked toward the northern horizon where the stars seemed to hang lower, brushing the tips of the jagged peaks. In the distance, nestled in a sheltered fold of the mountain that he knew led toward the warmer lowlands, a tiny, flickering point of light appeared. It wasn't a star, and it wasn't a reflection of the moon. It was the steady, orange glow of a campfire, hidden from the world, but visible to the man who knew exactly where to look. Elion watched that light for hours, his eye pressed to the glass, his hand resting on the cool brass of the machine. He knew that the war was still churning in the valleys below, and he knew that the prejudices of their two peoples remained as jagged and cold as the mountain itself. But he also knew that somewhere out there, a shadow scout was looking at the same stars, holding a brass sextant in her calloused hand, and remembering the warmth of a lonely tower. He climbed down from the telescope and sat at his desk, picking up his quill. He didn't record a scientific observation. Instead, he opened his leather-bound journal to the page where he had kept the coordinates of the frost lilies. Beneath the sketch of the woman with the yellow eyes and the brave heart, he wrote a single line in his precise, scholarly hand. "The light is never truly lost as long as there is someone to tend the flame." He closed the book and leaned back, the ticking of the clocks no longer sounding like a countdown, but like a heartbeat. The observatory was a sanctuary, a bridge between the earth and the heavens, and for the first time in his life, Elion felt that he was exactly where he was meant to be. He reached out and turned down the wick of the oil lamp, letting the starlight fill the room. The mountain was silent, the wind was still, and in the deep, cozy darkness of the peak, the astronomer and the scout were home. He rested his head against the high back of his chair, a soft, content smile touching his lips as he drifted into a deep, peaceful sleep, guarded by the stars and the memory of a woman who had taught him that even a crippled soul could learn to fly.